everyone, Stormy Strike here, and welcome to this year's BreyerFest 2022 Surprise Horse Speculation video. In this video, we'll be discussing what the special run model rotating draft surprise might be. Before we begin, a quick disclaimer that I do not currently work for Breyer, and I definitely do not actually know what the surprise horse model is going to be. All my guesses and theories in this video are based on public information and patterns from past BreyerFests. This is all just speculation, and I can in no way guarantee what the surprise model is going to be. Now for some very quick history behind my surprise horse speculation videos. I started this series back in 2015 and have been doing it every year since. Here's a chart of where on my top 10 list of guesses the actual surprise mold ended up being. In 2015 and 2018, my top guesses actually ended up being correct. Other years I got close, and then some other years not close at all. Without further ado, let's talk about this year's surprise model rotating draft surprise. Sometimes Breyer says something in the blog posts about their surprise models that appears to give a little hint at what the surprise model might be, but this year there is nothing that seems to be even remotely a hint at all in this blog post. The only possible hint we get is maybe the model's name. Now when we hear draft, most of us are probably going to automatically be thinking of draft type horses. It is very possible that the surprise model could be a draft, but it is also very possible that it could not be a draft type horse at all. I personally believe that the surprise model mold could really go either way this year. There are also a couple other possible hints in the model's name, such as rotating. Maybe that's a clue that the surprise model is on a mold that looks like it is rotating. Then there's another hint of what the model's name and logo refers to, which is a barrel of draft beer. That's not quite as easy to associate with any particular Breyer molds, but I think when many of us think of beer and horses together, we think of the Budweiser Clydesdales. So perhaps this is a hint that the mold could be thought of as a Clydesdale? Of course, we can also take into consideration the theme of BreyerFest, which is Germany. There are many German breeds that are drafts, warm bloods, and ponies. I highly doubt we'd see any ponies due to how small they are, but again, drafts would fit really well with the theme, and I think warm bloods would work really well too. There is of course the possibility, however, that the surprise model mold might not be related to any of these things. There have been surprise models in the past that didn't really relate to the surprise model name or even the theme of BreyerFest. The most commonly used example is the stock horse Latigo as the Bollywood surprise in 2017. Even last year with the 7 Arts surprise model, we were all speculating that it might come in 7 different colors, but that was not the case. That was just the name of the model. It is really a toss-up on if the surprise horse mold will match the model's name really well or not. There are examples in the past of the surprise horse name matching the mold perfectly, however, like the Dark Horse Surprise in 2018 and CC Shuffle in 2013. Interestingly, there has never been a draft horse surprise model before. It could then be argued either way that this means that this year's surprise model is less likely or more likely to be a draft horse. Therefore, as I consider mold possibilities in this video, I will be taking into account both draft type and non-draft type horses. Let's begin going over the specific rules for the surprise horse mold based on the patterns of previous BreyerFests. The easiest part of trying to figure out what the surprise horse mold might be is to first eliminate all the molds that it can't be. Remember that Breyer can technically do whatever they want and completely ignore these rules, but so far all of the BreyerFest surprise horse models have followed these rules except for the very first one in 2009, which is really an outlier, and I really don't ever take this model into account when analyzing BreyerFest patterns. Here are the surprise horse rules based on patterns in the past. The surprise horse will likely not be a mold that's already been a surprise model, being used as a BreyerFest model this year, been used as a BreyerFest special run or store special the previous year, been used recently within the past 6 months leading up to BreyerFest, and lastly will not be a vintage or a widely unpopular mold. By official vintage standards, vintage currently means any mold that was introduced prior to 2002, But in this case, I will still often take into consideration molds that came out in the 1990s, even though they are technically considered vintage now. Additional points and rules to take into account: the surprise mold often, but not always, coincides with the BreyerFest theme, is at least 3 years old, is a modern and popular mold, has had a recent but not too recent release on the mold. The rough time frame I've kind of figured out is between 6 and 18 months. So far, the mold has always been a traditional scale horse or large pony. There have never been any smaller molds, other equine animals, or foals. It's always been adult traditional scale horses or larger ponies. Lastly, it is often not the same breed type as the surprise model from the previous year. So in this case, the surprise model for 2021 likely won't be a stock horse since last year's mold was a stock horse. In the past, I have taken into account the live auction pattern, which means that the mold was used as a live auction model the previous BreyerFest year, but I've decided not to really take that into consideration anymore, as last year's model did not fall into that pattern, and neither has the model from 2019. At this point, I think this pattern has either been a coincidence, or maybe Breyer caught on to people noticing this pattern and now they're trying to mix things up so that the surprise model mold isn't as obvious. Now I have applied all of these rules to the traditional scale molds on Identifier Breyer. There are some molds that are not listed on Identifier Breyer currently, but they are all more recent molds that wouldn't count anyway, so I'm not going to worry about those. I have put red X's over all of the molds that are extremely unlikely to be used based on some of the rules, such as molds that have already been a surprise model or are a current BreyerFest model. Molds marked out with a gray X means they are highly unlikely for other reasons, usually because they are a vintage mold or too small, a foal, and so on. Then there is the green box. I use the green box over the molds that I think have a pretty good possibility of being the surprise model, especially if there is nothing that really restricts them from being used. Lastly, you may notice that some molds are not marked with an X or a green box. They don't really have anything that makes them a definite no, but they're also just not a very strong possibility either. Now I'm going to quickly post the different pages of molds here. First up on this page, we have the American Saddlebred. I did decide to mark him as a possibility, but it is important to note that he is an American Saddlebred, which means he does not really go well with the German theme. On page 2, I went ahead and marked down the Arabian Mare. She is another one where the breed doesn't really work for the theme, but she kind of has other things going for it, so I decided to throw her up there anyway. On the third page, I almost marked Forever Siege at first, but since she is a stock horse, I really don't think she is going to be a stock horse this year, since last year's surprise was a stock horse. So I ended up not marking down any of the stock horses as a surprise model, except for one. I did mark down Newsworthy, although I do feel like when it comes to his size, he's just kind of on the cusp of being too small to be a surprise model. However, with the German theme, I feel like this mold could maybe work. I also have marked down here Othello, aka Winter Song. Despite this mold being over 20 years old now, he is still immensely popular and could fit the theme and name of the surprise model very well. On to the next page, we have Bluegrass Bandit written down. But she's yet another one where she doesn't really fit like the theme, but I kind of just decided to add her anyway. Next page is the Racking Saddlebred Stallion, aka Hamilton, and he's actually a good possibility because despite the fact his breed does not work for the theme at all, he is very, very, very popular. On page 6 here we have Cigar, who was kind of a tentative ad because I do feel like he's becoming kind of a little too old now, and kind of not as popular. He's at least just not quite as popular as some other molds on this list, but I decided to add him anyway. Here's also the Cleveland Bay. He is a guy that I think would fit the theme and name of the surprise horse pretty well. He also has 3 different main options, which could be really fun to see. The Connemara Mare is also on here. She is a pony, which would work for the theme, and she is also, I think, a big enough pony that she could still be used as a surprise model. Lastly on this page, I did also add Ruffian. She is technically a warm blood, so I could see her maybe being the surprise. On page 7, I did almost add Desatado, but his breed doesn't really match, and then I also remembered that he does have a Halloween release coming up soon, and that is probably going to get released around the time of BreyerFest, so I really think that kind of decreases his possibility of being the surprise. I did put Salinero as a possibility though. This guy is a gorgeous warm blood who I feel is still a little underutilized for what a nice warm blood mold he is. On page 8, I did put the Shaggy Arabian, or Yasmin, as a tentative possibility. I'm really not feeling her for this year, but I do love this mold, even though she kind of really doesn't fit the theme at all. Page 9, I did go ahead and add the Shire Gelding, but I do not think he is very likely just for the fact that he was recently released as the Collector Club Web Special Model Cardinal. And if it wasn't for that Web Special release, I think he would be a much stronger possibility. I also added the Show Jumper, or Show Jumping Warm Blood. He is a very nice warm blood, and I think could make a very nice surprise horse. I went ahead and put Silver, even though this mold does not really work breed-wise for the theme, but I do know that Vincent from Da Vinci Creations, who is from Germany, loves the Silver mold, and wouldn't it be really funny if Breyer made the surprise model Silver just to torture poor Vincent? On page 10, the Spanish Stallion, or Duende, is another one that I kind of marked him down, but I don't think it's likely because he is a Spanish horse. Now, Emerson, or the Standing Thoroughbred, I think is actually a pretty good possibility though. I actually almost completely forgot about Gofford until further along into making this video. I'm not sure why I completely forgot about this mold, but he could very well be a possibility. On page 11, I did mark the Beritian mold as a possibility, and to be more specific, I am specifically marking down that it's like the Vanner version of his mold, not the odd Spanish version of his mold. I'm going to kind of not count that one. I'm thinking more of just the original Irish Cob version. I would have normally marked down Huckleberry Bay on this list, but I think I am going to leave him off this year. I personally love this mold, and I know many others do too, but since his breed doesn't really fit the theme at all, and he is getting on the older side now, I decided not to add him. I also did not add the Icelandic, even though it is a pony. It is one of those molds that I think is just too small to be the surprise model. Getting towards the end here, with Kennebec Count is another one that I think actually could be possible, but I don't think he's really popular enough to use, so I didn't actually end up adding him. The Trotting Arabian Mare, or Weather Girl, I went ahead and threw her on the list, but I don't think she is very likely because of her breed, and I just don't really feel like she'll be the surprise this year. The Walking Thoroughbred, or Carrick, however, I did add because I think he fits the theme well enough. On page 13, I marked down Wixom as a pretty good possibility, as she is a big giraffe mare. She'd fit the theme and name very well this year. And on the final page, I did go ahead and mark down Bobby Joe, and the only reason I did that is because she is rotating. Otherwise, she is a stock horse though. I don't think has a strong possibility there, but I just feel like I had to add her since she is rotating. Now that we've gone through all the molds, I put down all 23 of the ones I had marked out in green into a chart here. I use this chart to help myself visualize different aspects of each mold that might come into play in the likelihood or unlikelihood of it being the surprise. I listed each mold name, their most recent release or releases, the mold breed type, when the mold was introduced, and how long it's been since then. Lastly, I also listed the mold sculptor, which is an aspect of the surprise model molds I'm more recently wondering if it has any patterns to, but I actually won't be really paying too much attention to that in this video. Interestingly, all the molds I have listed here except for 2 of them have at least one thing that makes the mold less likely to be the surprise. It could be the mold's age, how recent its most recent release has been, or breed type. The only 2 molds that didn't really run into any of these issues are the Standing Thoroughbred, aka Emerson mold, and the Walking Thoroughbred, or Carrick mold. I will be automatically adding these 2 molds to my top 10 list for that reason alone, but they aren't necessarily going to be at the top of that list. Despite all of the other molds on this list having aspects to them that makes them less likely, I believe that there are other things that work strongly in their favor, especially when it comes to things like popularity. Now I'm going to go ahead and narrow down this list further and present to you my top 10 mold guesses. I'm going to go through each of them and explain why I chose each of those molds. So let's start counting down my top 10 guesses for the surprise model. Number 10. Goffert. I actually had the Connemara mare on this spot originally, but with her last release being a Gambler's Choice model, and then I remembered that her stablemate version is in the Best of BreyerFest stablemate set this year, I decided to put Goffert here instead. Goffert doesn't quite fit when it comes to the breed he was originally intended to be, which is a Friesian, but I could see this mold easily being interpreted into other breeds. Like, I could technically even see him being a German Black Forest horse. Unfortunately, this mold hasn't had a super recent release. The last release on this mold was Crystalline in 2020. If he had a more recent release, I would have put him up higher on this list, as I think I could see this guy being this year's surprise model. He is a little draft-like, and I could see them putting a lot of fun colors on him. Number 9. Showjumper. I've had this mold up for the surprise horse guesses many times here, and here he is again. This fun guy is a warm blood, so he would fit the German theme of BreyerFest well enough, even if he doesn't fit the draft horse aspect. I think this is a generally well-liked mold. He's not extremely popular, but seems to be liked still. I feel like his level of popularity is kind of similar to the Giselle mold, which was released as the surprise model in 2020. There are 2 issues with this guy. One is that his most recent release was the 2020 Celebration horse. Most often, the BreyerFest Surprise Horse mold has had a release sooner than 2 years, usually more like a release within the past year to a year and a half before BreyerFest. So that could maybe be an issue. The second possible issue is this mold's age. It is now currently 19 years old, when so far the oldest surprise horse mold has been 15 years old. However, other than those 2 possible issues, I do think this mold would make a very nice surprise model, and he does have the bonus factor of having some fun different mane and tail options that they could throw in there. Number 8. Emerson. As I previously mentioned, this mold does not have anything pattern-wise that stops it from being a strong possibility for the surprise horse model. He's had a recent release and a running release right now in the past year. He is a warm blood, which technically works with the German theme. He is a pretty new but not too new mold, and he is fairly popular. Personally, I really like this mold and would love to see it as a surprise model someday, but I don't really feel like he's going to be the surprise model this year. I can't really explain why, but it just doesn't feel right. I think maybe it's because there is already a standing warm blood in the BreyerFest model lineup this year. Number 7. Walking Thoroughbred. This is the other mold that technically doesn't really have anything holding it back from being the surprise. It has had a release in the past year. It is a warm blood. Personally, I prefer Emerson over this mold, but I feel like this mold would work better as a surprise for this year for some reason. I don't know exactly, but I just feel like he's a little bit more likely over Emerson right now. Number 6. Cleveland Bay. I really wanted to put this mold higher up on this list because I think he would make such a great surprise horse. He has the fun different mane options. He's a fun mold that fits the BreyerFest theme and the surprise horse theme. He'd just overall be such a great surprise model for this year's BreyerFest, but there is one kind of major problem, and that is that he has not had a release for 3 years. The last release was him as the Celebration horse in 2019. So far, all of the BreyerFest surprise model molds have had at least one release within the past 2 years of them coming out as the surprise. 3 years is definitely pushing the pattern, and if it wasn't for that fact, I would have put the Cleveland mold as probably one of my top 2 guesses. Number 5. Salinero. This is yet another model that's been on my list of surprise horse guesses many times, and he's often near the top of the list. I have yet again placed him fairly high on this list, although there is one thing about him that makes me less confident that he will be the surprise model, and that is that his most recent release was back in 2020. That is once again at the 2-year point where it seems a little less likely that he'll be used, but not quite out of the question. This handsome warm blood could make a nice German-themed surprise model, I think. Plus, this mold is originally a Hanoverian, which is a German warm-blood breed. That alone, I think, makes him even more likely to be the surprise model compared to some of the other molds I've talked about. Number 4. Wixom. This big girl is a pretty strong possibility. She has had a recent release last year. She is a pretty big draft horse, which very much fits the German theme and the surprise horse name. She kind of feels like a horse that would work for the beer aspect of the surprise horse too, probably because she looks like she could be pulling some big wagons or carts full of barrels. There are some possible issues with this girl though. For one, her mold is 21 years old now, and while I feel like a lot of the hobby really likes her, I don't know if she would really be considered that popular or not. Another potential issue is just how big she is. Could she be considered too big to be a surprise model? It's hard to say, but as one of, if not the biggest Breyer molds, it is something to take into consideration. I have some mixed feelings on this girl overall and if she will be used or not, but I think the fact that she works so nice for the theme is what really made me put her up so high on this list. Now for my top 3 guesses. Number 3, Hamilton. Yes, Hamilton is not a draft horse, nor even a breed that resembles a horse breed that originates in Germany. So why is he so high on the list? To simply put, his overwhelming popularity and how he's falling into a pattern very similar to Dundee last year. I had some doubts last year about the Dundee mold because it had 3 releases in 2020, which was the year prior to the 2021 BreyerFest, of course. But that did not stop Breyer from using that mold. The Hamilton mold is experiencing a very similar pattern in that the mold has had 3 releases last year in 2021. He came out as a Collector Club Web Special, much like Dundee did. He then came out as a regular run, again, much like Dundee. And then he technically had a 3rd release as one of the glossy Collector Club Appreciation models. Now it could be argued that because he follows that pattern so closely that he won't be used again. It could also be argued that they won't use such a new mold again this year, but there really doesn't seem to be a pattern on the newness of the mold that Breyer uses for the surprise model. As long as it hasn't been like the past 2 years, I don't think that's really something Breyer takes too much into account when picking the surprise horse model mold. And they've released surprise horse models with molds that are a similar age to the year prior in the past. It makes more sense maybe when you're actually looking at this aspect of the chart of how old a mold is when it came out as each BreyerFest Surprise Horse. As of late, I feel like Breyer is really taking note of which molds people really love and are really considering them when they are planning new releases. I mean, look at the Georg mold, for example. He's had 3 releases in 2021 and already 2 more releases this year. And I doubt they would be using him quite so much if it wasn't for the fact that they're seeing he is a very popular mold right now. Breyer wants to sell lots of models, and what better way to sell lots of models than to take another very popular mold, slap a bunch of different colors and finishes on it, and watch it sell out. Although realistically, it probably won't sell out actually at BreyerFest. It would probably sell out online after BreyerFest, since Breyer's new special run system is very different. It hasn't been confirmed, by the way, that they'll be selling special runs online after BreyerFest, but that is probably what's going to happen. Anyway, that is my explanation of why Hamilton is so up high on my list, and I would like to lastly note that he oddly seems like he fits the name and logo for the surprise model to me. Despite not being a draft or really having anything to do with beer, there's just something about him that feels like it would oddly work. I really don't know how to explain it. Number 2... Brischen. Unlike Hamilton, this mold can be considered more of a drafty type horse. It can also be considered a pony kind of too. Irish cobs are just kind of a weird horse breed like that. While Irish cobs themselves do not originate in Germany, I feel like this mold could still sort of resemble other draft breeds. And again, I am talking strictly about the original Brischen mold body, by the way, not the weird Larido version or whatever his name is. And I do not think this version will be the surprise, or at least I really hope it's not. But if they would use any version of this mold, they would use the original version, since that so much better resembles a draft horse. However, I still could see them using the different mane and tail options for this mold. Since they've done a unicorn on this mold, heck, why not? Maybe the decorator will also be a unicorn. Like I was talking about with Hamilton and last year's Dundee, the fact that this mold has had 2 releases last year might actually mean it is maybe even more likely to be used. There is one possible problem with this mold, which is Breyer recently announced the regular run Fjord. I'm not going to be able to pronounce this. This sort of Frisian portrait model guy for 2022. This model is sort of cutting it close to this mold being too recently used to be the surprise model. But there are 2 things that make me think this is not going to be a problem. One, the most obvious, is this model is the Spanish version of this mold, not the more Vanner drafty type one. And 2, I don't think Breyer was really expecting the owner of this model to pick this mold to represent their horse. There's even some Facebook comments I saw that pretty much outright said this straight from the horse's mouth. Don't ask me for receipts because I did not screenshot those comments, but that is what I saw. So despite this mold having a sort of 2022 release, depending on how you look at it, everything else about this mold lines up for it to being a strong possibility for the surprise. It fits the theme and the breed type. It's not too old or too new at 10 years old currently. It's had some recent releases in the past 18 months, and it is a very popular mold. Maybe not quite as popular as Hamilton is currently, but this mold has a lot of fans. And to show just how popular it is, the regular run model on this mold that came out in 2013 is still being produced. Yes, that's right, Breyer has not retired that model. They are still making and selling it even after almost 10 years because it is just that popular. All of these reasons accumulated into why I put the British mold as my number 2 guess, but now it is time for my final guess at the very top of the list. Number 1, Othello. This mold right here has a lot going for it, and despite there being 2 things that might make this mold a little less likely to be the surprise model, everything else about him just goes above and beyond, and in a way cancels out the factors that might make him less likely to be used. Let's go ahead and go over those factors right now that could potentially be holding this mold back from being the surprise. First off, he is an older mold. He's actually technically considered a vintage mold now. The Othello mold is currently 23 years old. It's hard to believe that that mold is that old now. However, the porcelain version of this mold was released in 1999, but the plastic version didn't come out until 2007. So if you're going to look at this mold's age by his plastic release, then he's actually only 15 years old, which does still fit into the surprise horse pattern set by previous surprise horse models. The second factor that is potentially holding this mold back is the fact that he has been a treasure hunt model in the past. As of yet, any of the molds that have been used as treasure hunt models have not been BreyerFest Surprise models, but that also doesn't necessarily mean that because they've been treasure hunt models in the past that they can't also become a surprise horse model. Plus, this mold was a treasure hunt model back in 2010, which was 12 years ago, so it does feel like plenty of time has passed for them to release this mold in a bunch of colors at once again. There's also kind of a third factor here, but I personally don't really believe it's much of a problem, and that is the fact that this mold has had so many different releases and colors over the years. Some may think that that makes him less likely to be the surprise model, but to that I say, I don't think it really matters. I mean, Lonesome Glory had a ton of releases and colors before he became a surprise model, and they still used him. There's still a ton of different horse colors they've never put on this mold that could be used. I just don't think the fact that he's had a lot of releases in the past is really going to affect his usage as the surprise model. So that's all the potential issues with this mold that could make it less likely to be the surprise, but as you see, I already kind of debunked them all, and if that's not good enough, then there's one major factor that can kind of wipe away all those aspects, I think, and that is the fact that this mold is so popular. No, seriously, this mold has been around for so long, and yet I still see him being super popular amongst collectors of all ages. Of course, there's lots of people that don't care for him, but I'm saying in general, he is an incredibly beloved and iconic Breyer mold. The fact that he's been such a timeless favorite really helps his chances of being the surprise. Plus, that's not all. This mold does work extremely well with the BreyerFest theme and the Surprise Horse model name and logo. Othello is obviously a draft horse, and on top of that, he makes a good Clydesdale, which, while not a German breed, is very much associated with what? Budweiser what? That's right, Budweiser beer, and there's also beers known as draft beers, and draft is the name of the surprise horse, and oh, you get my point. This mold is like a perfect representation for the surprise model, which may mean that makes him too obvious to be the surprise model, but as mentioned, Breyer has done molds that perfectly fit the BreyerFest theme and surprise horse name before, so at the same time, that doesn't mean it necessarily makes him less likely to be the surprise. Lastly, this mold has had a recent enough, yet not too recent, release in 2021 as the decorator model Equidae. Therefore, all in all, he fits the theme and breed type. He can be considered in the right mold age range, depending on how you look at it, and he's had a release in the past 18 months. Everything is just lining up for him, and that is why I picked him as my number one guess. There's my top 10 list for the surprise horse mold. Keep in mind that Breyer could come out with some new releases between now and BreyerFest that may end up eliminating some of the molds on my list. If that ends up being the case, I may do an updated surprise horse speculation video closer to BreyerFest, but since I do plan to go to BreyerFest in person, I may be too busy getting ready for BreyerFest to have the time to make and upload a video, so I cannot promise that I will do an updated speculation video, unfortunately. It also may or may not really be necessary, depending on what other models Breyer comes out with this year. The next topic I want to briefly discuss about the surprise model is the question of how many variations of the surprise model can we expect. My guess is we'll probably see 5 variations again like we did last year. That is usually what they've been doing in these past years. I know there have been some odd years out, like there were technically 6 variations in 2019, and then there are only 4 variations in 2020, but my guess is that there will be 5 for this year, maybe 4, but I doubt there would be any less or more than that. And of course, I am guessing there will be matte and glossy versions of each finish, possibly maybe only one finish for the decorator like they've kind of done in the past, but most likely each color will get its own glossy and matte finish. Final topic of this video is speculating about the colors for the rotating draft surprise. With the surprise horse model, there is often, but not always, a solid colored model, a pinto, an Appaloosa, and a decorator. We'll probably see that again this year, I'm thinking, although it is also possible that they don't use one of those broader color patterns. I have seen a few people speculate that the surprise model will have colors that represent different colors of beer, like a Palomino, a chestnut, and a bay. This could maybe be possible, but if it is, I definitely see that those wouldn't all be solid colored horses though. I'm sure there'd be some pintos and Appaloosas within that mix. But I think we'll see other fun colors mixed in there too, like we often do with the surprise models. There is usually quite a variety of colors and patterns. Personally, I'm hoping that we see a blue roan. We haven't had a blue roan color in the surprise models for quite some time. I also think a nice black blanket Appaloosa would be nice. I'm sure we'll see a fun little variety of realistic horse colors, although honestly it is really hard to predict exactly what we might see. Then there's the question of whether or not there will be a decorator this year, and I think there will be. Most of the surprise models in the past few years have had decorators, and there's just so many fun options out there for a German-themed decorator. Because the BreyerFest costume contest does have a grim fairy tale theme to it, I do think it is possible we could see the decorator model being a unicorn, perhaps. There is even a coat of arms in Germany that has a unicorn on it, so I could see a unicorn being possible for this year's decorator. Maybe they'll give it some crazy colors than just a classic white unicorn, but I think that is something that could be fun. I know there's a lot of people that are really sick of unicorns, but I think they are still cool and there's just a lot of fun things you can do with them. Another thing I wonder is if they will do the decal pictures on a traditional decorator model again. They haven't really done that for the surprise models or any large-scale models for quite a while. I'm just thinking that a pretty landscape or a scene from a fairy tale would be kind of neat, sort of like the past decorator model Romance. I would also like to see the decorator as a clearwear model. I used to not really care for clearwear models, but now I'm really into them. So it'd be fun to see them do something cool with clearwear again. And considering that they have done several neat clearwear surprise models in the past, I could definitely see them doing another one this year. It's always so hard to predict what the colors of the surprise models are going to be most of the time, but it's still kind of fun to speculate on them. And that will wrap up my BreyerFest speculation video. I hope you guys enjoyed, and please let me know down in the comments what your guess is for the rotating draft surprise. I love hearing your guys' theories and the fun color ideas you come up with. Thank you for watching. Leave a like if you're excited to see what the 2022 BreyerFest surprise model is going to look like. And if you want to see more BreyerFest and model horse videos, be sure to subscribe and check out some of my playlists of past model videos, which I will have listed in the video description down below. Have an awesome day, and I will see you in the next video. Bye, everyone!